Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Adapter's webinar today, Fast Track Transformation for Nonprofits. Quick introduction then, everybody, to Adapter. For those of us new to today's session, we are a specialist consultancy focusing on all aspects of change management with a particular focus on technology. We only work with membership organizations, charities, associations, etc. Totally supplier independent. And joining us today, myself, Keith Collins. I'm a senior consultant at Adapter, focus on things like digital strategy, CRM strategy and selection. Interested in a healthy way, I think, in technology trends as they relate to the work that we do. Joining us also, a close friend and colleague, Jonathan Cook from Insightful, a fundraising innovator and a charity insight specialist. And my colleague, Ian, one of the partners at Adapter, with a similar kind of background to myself on CRM strategy, selection, ICT strategy, those kind of things. Just quick context, therefore. I think it's 4 months that we've been working in this new world, and lots and lots of change has been forced upon the world and non-profit organisations as part of that. Lots of challenges around how we approach this change process, and lots of questions around the technology that we need, around how we engage with people, what it means for policies and procedures. And I suppose the work that we've been doing with our clients over that last 4 months has been trying to put together a holistic response to these challenges. If you joined us for the sessions in June, the focus was very much on the right-hand side of this circle, what it meant in terms of ways of working, people, culture, policies and procedures, tools for collaboration. The approach now is very much on the left-hand side and what it means in terms of engagement and what it means in terms of fundraising, membership, service delivery, those kind of things. We've got today's session really is more reflective, looking back at some of the innovations that have happened over the last 4 months. The session next week is thinking about what the future might look like as we move beyond the immediate COVID-19 crisis. So yes, today's programme going to be looking at some very interesting and exciting innovations that have taken place in the fundraising world over the last few months, likewise with service delivery and volunteering. Jonathan and myself will take those in turn. We're then going to have a short curated Q&A session. So please do make it as interactive as you can and answer as many questions, ask as many questions as you can, and we'll attempt to answer them. And then my colleague Ian will step in and talk about, compare those innovations with the normal world, I suppose, and what's been suspended in the name of understandable expediency, and a few more Q&As. At which point I will hand over to my colleague Jonathan to introduce himself in a little bit more detail and take us on an exciting tour of innovation. Jonathan, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jonathan. Yes, I work for a company called Insightful. We kind of are kind of nosy people. We like to look at to see what people are doing and why they do certain things and why they give a charity in this way and that way. And I guess in the last few months we've been looking at some of the things that donors and charities and fundraisers have been doing in response to the COVID-19 crisis. But particularly here, I'm going to look at some of the innovations that we have spotted over the last few months. Some of these are maybe more advanced than others, but the point of this is all about having a little look at some of the innovations and why organisations have done those and how have they reacted and how have they helped them in this crisis. So let's move on to the next slide, and here are the 4 key things that I have noted since the crisis, or since lockdown began at the end of March of this year. These 4 things have been the key things that have helped organisations innovate this time. The first is just the speed of the decision-making process. The second is the removal of decision by committee. Number 3 is the use of existing technology, the stuff that already exists. And number 4 is the idea that good enough is better than perfect. Let's have a look at each 4 of these now, and you'll see what I mean about why I think they're innovative in the sector. So let's move on to the first one, speed of decision making. So let's move on to the next slide. So you've probably all come across Zoom and Microsoft Teams. You may not have come across them 12 months ago. What organizations have done is they have very quickly embraced these bits of technology to hold conversations internally and have team meetings and communicate with donors and funders alike. Now, the reason why I'm fascinated by this is because when I say speed decision making, organizations moved to these platforms in a matter of days after lockdown happened, and they were told you can't go into the office. There wasn't really any debate around this. They just went, right, we need to do something now. And so they just logged on, they set up accounts and moved online very quickly. Let's move on to the next slide. Some of the other things that organizations did was produce fundraising materials and appeals very, very quickly. So here's an example from Action for Children. The lockdown began on the 23rd of March 2020, and I first saw this advert on my phone only 3 days later. They had produced this relatively cheaply, I guess, and relatively quickly, and got it out on the internet within 3 days. So let's play and have a look at it.
Coronavirus has thrown all our lives, our communities, and the UK into crisis. There were already over 4 million children in the UK locked into poverty before coronavirus. Action for Children work throughout the UK with the most vulnerable families. And now these families need you more than ever. Help Action for Children cover the cost of essentials, food, nappies, and cleaning products for the most vulnerable families across the UK.
So international aid agencies, your Oxfams, your Save the Children's, have actually got quite used to producing fundraising materials very, very quickly. If there's ever an earthquake or a volcano or flood or whatever it is, they can get appeals out very quickly. But actually, for UK-based organisations, it's quite rare to have done that, to produce materials that quickly. There's usually a big process of refining ideas and brainstorming and that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, this was just produced quickly, get it out, because speed is more important than perfection, I guess, in this instance. So that's the first thing that I've been impressed with, just getting things out quickly. So let's move on to the second one, which is the idea of removal of decision by committee. The charity sector is the most wonderful sector in the entire world. That's why I work in it. It's also the most frustrating sector in the entire world. And decisions by committee is quite a common thing that we see in the charity sector, that ideas go around and round and round and round and round. A big group of people decide on what it looks like. So the next innovation I'm going to show you is basically how an organization just made a decision like that, clicked their fingers and went, right, we've got to solve something, what should we do? So let's move on to the next slide. This is Save the Children in the Netherlands. When lockdown happened in the Netherlands, when they had to do social distancing in the Netherlands, their door-to-door and face-to-face and street fundraising basically went to zero because you couldn't do that in social distancing. So what I imagine lots of organisations would have done is got together, had a big committee meeting about how they're going to solve this problem and come up with maybe very complicated solutions. Whereas somebody at Save the Children in the Netherlands said, why don't we just buy 1.5 2 metre long mats and lay them out on the floor between the fundraiser and the person that they're talking to. Now, this isn't the most innovative, greatest idea that's ever happened. It's a red mat with some writing on it. But the point is, they didn't have to have a big, long conversation about whether or not they should do this. They just said, yes, buy some mats, roll them up, put them in your bag, get them out. And that's the key thing here. By removing that big, complicated structure of decision making, they were able to do something really quickly. I imagine if they had a big discussion about this internally, they'd have come up with a solution, but it would have been very complicated and probably would have taken some time to roll out. Whereas a map probably took about a day to order and distribute amongst its fundraisers. Now, if imitation is the best form of flattery, sorry, actually, move on to the next slide. I've actually got thing about the press coverage they got. So they managed to get this in the Volkskrant magazine. My Dutch is not very good, I'm afraid, so if that pronunciation is terrible, I'm sorry. This magazine or newspaper has a readership of 6 million. Now, considering the population of the Netherlands is 18 million, that was seen by a third of the entire population of the Netherlands. That's quite an impressive media coverage for it's essentially just a rolled up mat. Moving to the next slide, as I said, imitation is the best form of flattery. Other organisations from around the world have copied this idea. We have got UNICEF. I think we have UNICEF in Brazil. We've got UNICEF in Africa, maybe there. Another Save the Children somewhere. Now, obviously, if somebody else is copying it, it's because your idea is really good. And it's great because it's easy, it's cheap, and everyone can copy it without any problem whatsoever. Moving on to the next slide. The other thing I wanted to note about this is one of the other things that decisions by committee means is that people were a bit too nervous about what will be the impact of doing something like this. By just making the decision quickly, they avoided any worry about that, and they just had to deal with any complaints and issues that came to them. And in fact, they had 0 complaints, and sign-up levels were 80% higher than pre-COVID-19 levels. But so just from the purchase of a mat, the transformation is magic. To the next slide, though, this hasn't happened for everyone. This is an actual conversation I've had with an IT director at a charity, where they said all of our staff are now home working, but the real challenge was checking out their home working setup, security, etc. So they wanted to go to that, the Zooms, Microsoft Teams process, and they were doing it, but their challenge was to work out security. And I said, amazing, but couldn't you have just solved all that by simply buying all your entire staff new work laptops? The director then said to me, SMT wouldn't authorise that as it would have been too expensive. I was like, oh, okay. How much would that have cost then? And the director said, well, actually, the saving we made on travel expenses for these past 3 months would have covered the cost of new laptops twice over. So there you go. They had a decision by committee there. They had a conversation worked out. We couldn't do that. It's too expensive. But actually, it wasn't too expensive, and they'd been a bit more innovative. They'd have been able to solve that problem much easier. So number 3 was use of existing technology. So the next slide just shows you 2 examples of which you probably almost don't have heard of, YouTube and Strava. These pieces of kit already exist, and I've been impressed with the number of organisations that have just gone, let's do that. At the next slide, you'll see I've got Just Giving in bid letters. Now, in 2000, when Just Giving first came out, a couple of years later, I remember seeing a number of organisations creating their own online giving platforms. Some of the big names kind of invested actually a serious amount of time and money in creating their own online giving platform, and they weren't as good as Just Giving. They didn't work as well, and eventually everyone just dumped it. When I'm not building my own one, why do that when the technology already exists? That's what's happened this time. Basically, people have looked at the existing technology and said, how can we jump on that? So let's go to the next slide. If this was a room of people, I'd say put your hands up if you've done PE with Joe. But here's Joe Wicks. Now, Joe Wicks just decided to do some online PE lessons for people, but he just transferred the money that he was being paid for the advertising to charities. Now, okay, he's not a charity, but I guess in this instance, he's a fundraiser. He didn't set up a new piece of kit to administer the donations. He didn't come up with anything too complicated. He literally said, I'm going to go on my YouTube channel, and any money that comes into my bank account from these streams, I'll transfer to charity. So just using an existing piece of kit. The second one is things like Strava. So Strava is a kind of fitness app that tracks your run, and there's a little organization here. We'll show you a little video here of an organization that decided to make a little event which allows social distancing, but where you could kind of map their logo. So let's have a look at their little advertising they've done. So I think this was supposed to be a Facebook advert. And you can see we make a little swan, and that I think was supposed to go out online. The next example is one of that of a fundraising campaign that is a little bit risque. It may offend slightly, but it's another really good example of using an app like Strava as a fundraising campaign. So we'll move on to the video. You have been warned if it's a bit risque. There you go. The next slide will show you some other examples of this, but basically the testicular cancer charity in New Zealand decided to encourage people to draw slightly rude pictures in their runs. This is something that could be done quite easily with social distancing. You're just going for a run. It involves the existing technology that already exists, Strava. It encouraged people to share with the existing piece of kit through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram by hitting share, and it was a real success. In fact, here are two examples of other people who have made interesting shapes. It even got a pilot in New Zealand to track a rather large phallus over New Zealand. But the thing I like about this is it didn't try and invent something new. It was just a kind of decent idea and used existing pieces of kit to do it. Which moves on to the final thing, which is that good enough is better than perfect. So move on to the next slide and you'll see what I mean by this. This is a quote or a conversation that was given to me by a sales director at JC&Co, the people who do kind of large advertising hoardings, and he said the private sector gets a new product 80% right, launches it onto the market, then spends the next 2 years fixing the 20% that doesn't work properly. The charity sector gets a new product 100% right, launches it onto the market, but then finds it's 2 years too late. We haven't been able to do that during this coronavirus crisis. We haven't had the luxury of spending 2 years to develop something 100% and launching it, and in fact often that's not the right thing to do. We've had to follow that model that the private sector follows. We've gone, what's good enough to launch? What's the minimal viable product? Let's launch that, because time is of the essence. We have to make decisions quickly. We have to get this out. And the next example is a really good one to show that. So it's an organisation that did a little fundraising activity involving those kind of pink wafer biscuits. And the thing I like about this is they'd made obviously all these cards that they were going to hand out to people in person. But then with lockdown, they obviously couldn't hand them out in person. So they just got a mobile telephone and filmed the card. This isn't the greatest video that's ever been made, but I think it is, given the circumstances, perfectly good enough to go out. Let's hit play and watch this. And probably the greatest, cheesiest music of any charity fundraiser that's ever existed. I really like that because it is literally someone in the office has got a mobile phone and made a very cheap, quick video by just filming the card. And now that's good enough. Like that got that out to people really quickly and spread around people far quickly, far easier than I think they probably would have imagined, and solved that problem of What do? We can't hand these out in person. So they're my 4 key things. These are the things that have been innovative, or the actions that have enabled the sector to be innovative over the last few months. One, speed of decision making, being able to sort of react quickly, not dilly-dally and just go, let's do this. Removal of decision by committee, allowing people to empowering to make the decisions themselves and not have to worry about having a big long debate around what should you do. Not trying to reinvent the wheel, not trying to create new bits of kit, but just going, right, what else is out there that we can just set up an account with and use. And that final idea of, we just need to get this out, so good enough is better than perfect. For me, those 4 key things are the kind of greatest innovations that I've seen in the last few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. We'll have some questions at the end of Jonathan's and my session in about 7 minutes time. If you can fire your questions our way, we'll do some curation. So yeah, my name's Keith. I'm a senior consultant at Adapter, and I just want to talk a little bit more about some examples around service delivery and volunteering, if that's okay. So one of the examples is an organisation that we've been working with, Trust, and a lot of this information is in the public domain. And I had a chat with their project manager guy about a week ago to check if it's okay to share, I suppose, at a very high level, some of the background of the challenges they've faced over the last few months and the ways that they have address those challenges and stepped up to those challenges. So one of the interesting things about the Charles Trust is, I suppose, they've from a service delivery and a volunteering perspective, they've experienced the mother of all double whammies. So the COVID-19 has caused a vast increase in demand. The amount of people needing emergency food parcels went up by a considerable amount, as you can see there, and they felt that pain. They felt that challenge very, very quickly, and alongside that, Trust volunteers very much fit into that latter category, more elderly demographic, and the majority of the Trust's service delivery provision of the food parcels actually happens on site in food banks. So they needed to address an increased demand for services, a reduced amount of their their normal volunteering resource, and also the fact that it needed to move from it being an in-building kind of experience to something that was much more mobile. So I mean, the experience and the journey they had, I suppose the experience and the journey is something that happened over a couple of days, is they needed to move to from an in-food bank collection to a delivery-based collection, and they needed to get a new temporary volunteer workforce up and running, and working with them really, really quickly. So I think there was an aspect of serendipity about this process. They were quite lucky that they already had a corporate partnership with British Gas, and one of the interesting things about British Gas is that quite a lot of their delivery drivers were on furlough during that, at the start of that particular period, because people would, there was not the demand to go out to people's houses and do the work that they would normally do. So there was an opportunity there that they wanted to seize upon. Now, fortunately, they had spent a few months in large committees working about what they wanted to do in terms of a long-term volunteer management solution for their organisation, operating across 400 odd food banks around the country and supporting the work of about 50,000 volunteers. So they already had a project and an idea of a long-term investment. What they needed to do, however, was to leverage that big picture, longer term project, and actually make something happen much more quickly. So they realised they needed something that was able to be put into the hands of volunteers, prospective volunteers, really, really quickly. Less focus on the in-house internal business processes and much more focused on the volunteer experience. Picking up on Jonathan's point earlier on of perfection being the enemy of good, they needed something that was good but not perfect, and they needed to focus on the most minimum of minimum viable products in this particular case, enabling a volunteer recruitment portal that, amongst others, those furloughed British Gas staff could sign up through. Working with their internal team, working with the suppliers in this particular case, they actually managed to implement a new stripped down volunteer management system over a weekend. Not months, not weeks, not days, over a weekend. And now, very, very quickly after that, if you went online with to look at some of those volunteering opportunities, you found they were full up. So they it enabled them to plug that gap, to innovate, recruit volunteers, and start delivering food parcels with different people in different settings very, very quickly. And similarly, just I suppose another example from another client that again is a very interesting story. Their challenge was around their traditional model, working with teenagers who have challenges with substance abuse. And traditionally, those teenagers would be brought together in group workshop sessions, facilitated workshop sessions to discuss their experiences and to work together to share those experiences and kind of find good ways, suitable ways to move on with their lives and to address those challenges. So face-to-face was no longer an option. So what was needed was a digital solution that would enable those same young people to work together, to collaborate in a very modern, relevant way for them. Facilitated workshop sessions. Vital to this particular piece of work was that it needed to have support of the kind of anonymity that these young people wanted to retain. Importance is also about the security of the data. So the first thing that needed to be borne in mind was the fact that these young people that would classically be coming along to these workshops were 14, 15, 16, 17, often from a variety of backgrounds. But one thing that was certainly common to them is that they were digital natives. They were smartphone or first or smartphone only. So I suppose the easy thing relatively early on in their process of quickly getting their heads around what this might mean in terms of a solution was to identify that certain things just would not work. So any technology solution that smacked of formal education was pretty much written off from the start. Google Classroom was certainly not going to be a part of their technology mix. Similarly, anything that smacked of something too formal, such as Microsoft Teams, was again probably not the kind of thing that was going to work for them. Similarly, in their quick conversations around what would work was writing off certain things that wouldn't work. So they knew they just didn't have enough time to build a bespoke solution. It was too costly and wouldn't get live quickly enough. And similarly, they needed to step aside from PCs and computers and laptops and actually put themselves in the shoes of the people that would be using these tools and using this service, and recognizing that a PC first approach was not going to work. So they quickly hit upon a solution, and the way they hit upon this solution was actually by asking some teenagers. So, the best way of finding out what a teenager is going to use in terms of technology is actually to ask some teenagers directly. And they told them that actually there was a gaming app, like a social media collaboration tool classically used by gamers, so people using Call of Duty and those kind of things, called Discord. And that tool, Discord, although a few years ago it had previously been primarily used for those gaming communities, had then been adopted by quite a variety of often informal communities of young people for similar purposes. So they went out and trialed that. What they then identified is there was still, despite the expediency and the need to actually do something quickly, they still needed to do a bit of due diligence. So they still needed to check the nature of the private servers you could create for discrete spaces on the Discord platform where other people couldn't go, and they needed to make sure that the anonymity was up to snuff as well, and able to provide the kind of data protection capabilities that they needed. And having done that, they then moved forward and extended the trial a little bit further. So again, what I liked about those two stories and those two experiences was, the fact that necessity was the mother of the invention in this particular case. Is they needed things in days, so they needed to move quickly and they needed to prioritize appropriately. And again, perfection very much the enemy of good. And again, the expediency of the situation made them focus on what was needed to deliver something good, where they needed to do a bit of due diligence, and when that needed to happen. And the recognition that they could get something out there that was 80% good enough, buy them time to attend to the other tweaks. And what they also, in both of those cases, they recognised very early on that the field of dreams, build it and they will come approach was probably not going to work. And actually, if they'd built it, people probably wouldn't have come. Before we move on to the next session with Ian, I'd just like to check on a couple of questions that people have fielded, and see particularly if Jonathan can answer any of these questions. So one of the questions was, did these organisations spend any money on these innovations, and if so, how much did they spend? Jonathan, from the experiences you've seen, how much money was doled out?
Well, surprisingly little, if I'm honest. Take That Action for Children Facebook advert. The advert itself probably didn't take a huge amount of time or resource to put together if they've got the internal staff and their kind of digital and media teams to put that together. It's some stock photographs. There's plenty of apps on the internet where you can produce that relatively cheaply, if not free. The advertising, it being Facebook advertising, could have been done for hundreds of pounds rather than thousands of pounds, depending on their targeting. I guess that the costs for all of those are putting together the marketing for it. Making a little video here or making a little image there, and then any sales for Facebook social media advertising. What I got from it is most organisations didn't pay £50,000 to a massive agency to develop something. I got that goes to my last point. Good enough is better than perfect. I think quickly produced internal stuff was good enough to put out quite quickly, and that therefore kept the costs considerably lower. So yeah, there was some cost, but compared to a full scale marketing campaign, a fraction of the cost from the past.
And there's another question I was picking up on the observation, that conversation you had with the head of IT. And the question is, were there any internal barriers from the IT department? So tell us more about that conversation you had and the context and the story there.
So I've spoken to a couple of quite a lot of my clients who have furloughed their entire workforce, or they've sent their entire workforce to work from home and probably furloughed half their workforce, maybe 3/4 of their workforce. IT directors and IT departments were, I can imagine, incredibly stressed for that first few weeks to get everybody onto home networks and video conferencing stuff. I'm sure that there was stress and anxiety from the IT department. I have to say, I don't think I've seen a huge amount of pushback, because I don't think there was a choice. Any pushback would have, been detrimental to the organisation being able to actually work. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the IT department has to just deal with it for a bit. I think next week's webinar, we're going to talk about how kind of these innovations can be sustainable and what can we do in the future with them. And I think that'll probably be covered there, because I don't want to say revenge of the IT department. That's not what I mean at all. But what I mean is many of those 20% of the things that might be slightly imperfect about them will have to be fixed. And I think that's where that balance will return between people trying to be innovative digitally and IT departments making sure that things are done correctly and safely and securely. Cool.
Thank you. To that point, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Ian to take us through some of the things that might have been suspended in the name of this understandable expediency. Ian, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So, as Keith says, I'm Ian Pritchard. I'm one of the partners at Adapter, and I get to have the longest title, I think, among 3 slots. And what I'm going to talk about, I think, for 5 or 10 minutes, is really how we deal with the challenges which I think are going to resurface on the other side of the crisis that we're in at the moment. How we are going to hold on to some of the good things that Jonathan and Keith have been talking about in terms of ways that the sector is able to do things faster, better, quicker when it's dealing in more and more of the expediency. So I'm reminded of the famous saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that has certainly been my experience. That the way organisations work, their history, what's in their DNA, has an enormously powerful effect on the ability to execute plans and change direction. And so I think culture does eat strategy for breakfast, but actually culture has such a voracious appetite that it's still got room for innovation at lunchtime. So the next thing I think that culture is arguably perhaps not a threat, but definitely a challenge to, is the pursuit of different ways of going about things, such as we've been talking about for the last 5 or 10 minutes. So just moving on to having a look at how that's possibly represented. I fished out an old picture from an Apple TV campaign, which some of us will remember, appropriately showing David Mitchell with a mask on and talking about viruses back in the day. And this was an Apple Mac advert trying to tell people that you're better off with a Mac because it doesn't get viruses like PCs do. But actually, if you look at the way they're dressed, David Mitchell and Robert Webb there, they're also representing Apple as being a looser, cooler, faster, more kind of, I suppose, relaxed utility than old-fashioned PCs and Windows, with David Mitchell there in a suit and tie and so on. And I think, although you might say, well, that's the way things used to be, it's much more merged and homogenous now. People don't think about IT and digital. They don't think about innovation and back office in that way anymore. I think there is a lot of that still in the culture, and so that's why I think things might actually start to revert to the old normal, even though as we emerge from the current coronavirus situation, we've learned a lot that would allow us to operate differently. And so I think there are tensions, if I can put it that way, and depending on how you look at each other, across the organisation, and how, for example, David Mitchell there representing safety, careful approach, security, and so on. You might see him as either the dead hand of bureaucracy, or you might see him as the steadying hand on the tiller. So let's have a look at perhaps some of the tensions that I think are going to have to be addressed for organisations to find the right balance here. So there is, I think, going to have to be a conversation around where the focus of the organisation's development is going to be. So for a lot of organisations, it's already moving towards what I suppose you might loosely characterise as a digital-led, digital-first type experience, as opposed to what might be a more traditional back office, heavy-duty engine room type approach to fundraising, volunteer management, and other things. But even for organisations where that is happening, what we see certainly is difficulty at the most senior levels in changing the thinking that goes with that, and to think digitally rather than and in terms of innovation, and potentially seeing some of those experiments not working out properly, which is going to have a dampening effect, I think, necessarily on innovation in the future, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case as we come out of the coronavirus again. If I take these slightly out of order, I suppose, just got to dip in quickly into the third one, their capability versus cost. One of the things that's going to get in the way, I think, for organisations who want to hold on to some of these innovative ideas is going to be the potential cost of them. Now, Jonathan and Keith are absolutely right that a lot of what organisations have been able to do has been very low cost, and in some cases effectively zero cost. But not all innovations will be as inexpensive as that, and some money is going to have to be spent. And there is going to be an issue, I think, around organisations feeling that they have got the internal capability, resourcing, expertise, and so on, and whether they can afford to bring that in order to carry some of those innovations through. And same is true for ambition versus experience, I suppose, because experience is another thing that organisations perhaps don't have. But necessarily, if you're innovating, there'll be areas where you don't have the experience. But just because you're doing something new doesn't mean to say that you can afford to take it on without knowing what you're doing. And so the ambition that organisations are going to have to retain that innovative approach, I think, is going to necessarily be challenged by trustees, by senior managers, who will say, well, this is a good idea, but actually we've never done it before. And is it safe? And we are, after all, the custodians of our supporters' carefully and painfully, in some cases, donated support. And we therefore need to steward that. We can't afford to waste it, certainly. And in a lot of cases, organisations are going to say we can't even afford to risk it. And I think, going back to Jonathan's point about 80% is good enough for a commercial organisation to get going with something and then tidy up the loose ends over the coming 2 years, that's, I would argue, easier to sell to a collection of shareholders than it is to a board of trustees representing the interests of supporters. And it's not to say that it shouldn't happen. It's not to say that organisations shouldn't take risk. But I think there's a mindset issue which needs to be addressed, and that tension needs to be resolved. Similarly, agility versus security. We touched briefly on Data Protection Act and due diligence and other things. I think there is quite a big issue there for organisations wanting to pursue some of these approaches after the immediate crisis of coronavirus has faded, because there will be questions about, well, can we do this sufficiently securely to protect the interests of our members, our volunteers, and also our legal compliance. So I think all of those are important, but I'll pick two more actually, just the two down at the bottom there, to talk about a little bit. So one is commerce versus culture, and this comes back for me to the cultural issue, and particularly the point about making decisions by committee. Now, I wouldn't want to defend committee-based decision making any more than was absolutely necessary. But another way to describe what goes on in the not-for-profit sector is a consultation rather than committee-based decision making. And the belief that there is, particularly, I would say, in service delivery organisations, perhaps more than membership bodies, well, the belief that it's important for the entire organisation to be at least engaged with, if not fully committed to, changes and ways of working, differences that are going to be introduced before those start to be implemented. And that is a big difference between, for me, the not-for-profit sector and the commercial sector. In the commercial sector, at least in principle, a group of senior managers can make a decision and expect that decision to be rolled out and people to comply, I suppose. In a commercial organisation, that's kind of expected. It may not always work that way, and actually a bit of consultation wouldn't hurt some commercial organisations anyway. But that is one of the big differences, I think. And so that takes us into the last point, which is really about change management, and whether organisations put their investment into innovative new technology and then pay the price, as it were, in terms of the change management effort that's going to have to go in on the people side, or whether they don't, whether organisations simply slide back to the old ways of working, to let culture gobble up some of that innovation in order not to take the risk, not to pay the price, and to keep a steady hand on the tiller. So those are for me the tensions that need to be resolved if we're going to keep these good things going. They won't keep going by themselves, is my point. And organisations are going to have difficult conversations in order to keep the whole thing alive.
Cool. Thank you, Ian. We've got a few more questions that I'd just like to, I suppose, touch upon and see if we can drill into those in the time that remains. One question: do you feel that, especially in times of crisis, output that looks too slick and too professional can actually be unhelpful? And how do we get that balance right?
So which one is that? Is that for any of us?
It's for any of you. Anybody that's got an opinion on that particular topic. I see where they're coming from.
Yeah, I'll say a quick thing, and then I'm sure Jonathan will. I'm reminded of a long time ago, when I was just starting out in the sector. Actually, this would be probably towards the end of the 80s, that long ago. And it was so long ago that laser printers had only just been invented. That's probably before most people's time, I'm thinking now. Anyway, I was working at the Children's Society back in those days, and I went along to the Salvation Army to see how they were doing things. And they'd invested in laser printers, and they were printing out appeal letters with these laser printers. And they were printing these appeal letters out with barcodes on the bottom. And there's a brand new thing, and they're little Scion light pen scanner things that they were using to get the returns back in and code them into the system very quickly. Anyway, the thing about these laser printer letters was that they could be printed beautifully in all sorts of different fonts. They printed them using Courier, and they printed them using Courier because they didn't want to upset their traditional supporter base who were used to receiving stuff that had come to them having been produced on a typewriter. So I think, and they were very successful, Salvation Army, back in the day doing that. And so my response to that is that absolutely, I think you can risk it. It depends on your demographic. Like everything else in life, well, most things anyway, it depends on your audience. And if your audience is going to be unbalanced by something that looks too slick and professional, then absolutely you need to adjust to what your audience is going to listen to and engage with. Would be my thing.
I love that idea that they'd printed it with a laser printer, looked like a bit like it was from done on a typewriter. That's great. I'm in total agreement. I think lots of the even TV programs that we've seen in the last 3 months that have been cobbled together quickly, we've been forgiving about them looking a little bit ropey, and people who appear on Newsnight and they're on the little screen, they're zooming in and from elsewhere. I think we've allowed ourselves to forgive people for this because of the unprecedented situation. There's always a public perception that charities spend too much money on CEOs and marketing. Discuss, that's another webinar down the line. But it is genuinely a public perception, whether we like it or not. And I think you're right, making something look far too slick and shiny plays into that public perception in a negative way. People know that charities depend on donations, and they like to think that charities are spending the money that they donate on the service delivery. So take that example I gave of the person that had filmed the leaflet with their mobile phone. I think you watch that and you get the gist of it. You know what you're going to do, and then you probably think that's really neat. They just stuck it together with a mobile phone. I think people are forgiving about that, and I think that probably enhances a bit. I don't know if I've got any empirical proof of that. That's something I might go away and try and work out, but that's my hunch.
Cool. One more question. I was supposed to go back to the innovation thing, and we can pick up this. We can obviously next week we're going to be talking about how we harness innovation in a sustainable way and bring the dead hand of bureaucracy and the innovation together. But I suppose the last question was, what do organisations need to do to keep these good ideas coming freely? How does that happen?
Okay, I'll go. So my thing would be that it kind of needs to happen at the top. What stops things happening in organisations is what happens in the room at the top, whether it's the board of trustees or the council or the senior management team. That is where things can stop. And so there needs to be, you need to engage with that. If you want to see innovation go through, then you need to engage with that level in the organisation. And the reason that all of the things that Jonathan and Keith have been describing have been able to happen is that the room at the top has been empty for the last few months. They haven't been there. And so they haven't been able to say, we need to talk to you about this before you get to go out and do it. But they're coming back. That room will be occupied again. And so the conversation needs to happen up there in order to allow these innovations to continue to come free, I think. Jonathan.
So I would agree. It's partly because the people at the top have not been around. But I think moving forwards, whenever people have said we can't do that because, and they then put a load of reasons why they can't do it, that's been shot out the water by a cannon. I mean, they've been that argument has now been obliterated. No, I'm speaking to people saying, can somebody work from home when they can't work from home because of X, Y, and Z? Well, do you know what? The entire workforce, the entire sector is working from home now, and we've done it. And do you know what? Productivity probably hasn't been damaged. It might even have gone up in certain areas. So one of the things I think going forward is whenever someone comes up with an innovative idea or wants to invest in some kind of innovation, they've got the argument, they've got the response when they're met with, oh, we can't do that because they've always got the argument now, well, we did it and we solved it and we did it quickly. So I wonder if that's going to make organizations less risk averse. I mean, there's going to be the issue of them having less money. So we've got to throw that into the mix. But I think, I hope they will be slightly less risk averse because they've seen that actually as a sector, we can innovate in a second and do good with it. And that we're not all going to go and work from home and sit in our beds till 2 PM and watch daytime TV. That actually, if we are doing something, are working from, we're actually doing our work and we're doing it really well in an environment we like. So that's, I'm hoping, will come from this.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you for everybody for your questions. So just a reminder of where we are with things. So today's webinar, which I hope you have enjoyed and found useful, is very much focusing on these areas, on the external engagement, and has really, I suppose, reflected upon the last 4 months and touched upon what the future might look like. Next Wednesday, same time, next Wednesday, 11 o'clock, we're going to take a sneak peek into Life Beyond. I'm tempted to call it Culture Eats, Strategy for Breakfast and Innovation for Lunch, but I might have to get that past Jonathan and Ian first. Looking ahead, and what we'll also touch upon is obviously the fact how Adapter can help you with those particular areas of work. But we'll be taking a sneak peek into the future. So if you can join us next Wednesday again at 11 AM, you'll be more than welcome. It'd be great to see you. And yeah, thank you for attending today. And goodbye, and have a great week. Bye bye.